My name is Anna Wright. I am 35. I still remember the first time it happened, though I was too young to fully understand. It was Christmas morning, the smell of pine and cinnamon filling the house, laughter and clinking dishes echoing from the kitchen. My little brother and I had just unwrapped our presents, and my parents' smiles seemed endless, until my sister's twins came over. I still remember that first Christmas as vividly as if it were yesterday. I was 8 years old, standing in our living room, bundled up in a sweater that was slightly too big, the smell of pine and cinnamon swirling around me. The tree was decorated with ornaments that glimmered like tiny stars, and presents were stacked neatly underneath, each one promising a moment of excitement. I was full of anticipation, thinking this holiday might finally feel different, that maybe, just maybe, I'd be part of the laughter and warmth that always seemed to swirl around everyone else. But then the door opened, and my sister's twins came bounding in, full of energy, their small dog yipping and jumping around their ankles. My parents' faces lit up in a way that I would come to recognize over the years, a look of adoration reserved exclusively for them. The twins tore into their presents with an almost feral joy, squealing and laughing, while the dog darted between them, carrying bits of wrapping paper in its mouth. I stood frozen in the corner, clutching my own small gift, unsure if I belonged at all. When I finally mustered the courage to ask if my children, or the imaginary children I sometimes dreamed about at that age, could ever join in the celebrations, my mother looked at me with a faint, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "There's no room for your kids." Her words hit me like a cold wave, a dismissal I didn't fully understand but felt in my bones. At that moment, I realized that some people's love could be conditional, measured by convenience rather than heart, and that my existence, or the existence of those I might love in the future, could be quietly, but firmly, denied. Over the years, this pattern repeated itself like a relentless echo. Holidays, birthdays, family gatherings, they all carried the same message. There was always room for my sister's family, for her twins, for the dog, for all the chaos and joy they brought. But for me, there was always a boundary, an invisible line I was never allowed to cross. I learned to stay quiet, to smile when I was hurt, to participate without expectation, and to swallow the sting of being overlooked. My own excitement and joy were tempered by the knowledge that my presence was somehow an inconvenience. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 12. The smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes filled the house, and my sister's twins ran around laughing, spilling cranberry sauce in their glee. I sat at the edge of the table, quietly picking at my plate, feeling both hungry and invisible. My attempts to join in the conversation were met with distracted nods, laughter that never reached my eyes, and a gentle but firm steering back to the sidelines. I started to understand that this wasn't just a one-time thing, it was a message that would shape my sense of belonging for years to come. By the time I was a teenager, I had perfected the art of invisibility. I learned to anticipate who would be welcomed and who would be ignored, to celebrate silently while watching the joy that could never include me. And yet, despite all the quiet resignation, a small part of me, the part that still believed in fairness and love, refused to go away. It whispered in the back of my mind that I deserved space, that someday I might have a place where I and those I loved could exist without apology or negotiation. That childhood exclusion, those early years of feeling unseen, didn't just hurt, it shaped me. It taught me resilience, patience, and the quiet strength to dream beyond the limitations imposed by others. And while it left scars, it also planted a seed, a longing for something better, something wholly my own. Even then, I knew, deep down, that one day I would find a space where there was room for me. As I grew older, the exclusion that had first stung as a child became a quiet, persistent ache that followed me through every holiday and family gathering. By my teenage years, I had learned the art of staying invisible. I watched from the edges, smiled when I was supposed to, and nodded along as everyone else celebrated. My sister's twins laughed and played, their dog darting around with boundless energy, and my parents' eyes always seemed to light up more for them than for me. I had learned not to question it out loud because I knew the answer would be the same. There was no room for my family, no space for me, no acknowledgement of the life I wanted to share with them. I remember countless dinners where I sat at the table, hands folded in my lap, picking at my food while my sister's kids screamed with joy, demanding attention, and receiving it without hesitation. I learned to smile through the hurt, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny to me, and to compliment things that didn't deserve praise, because if I didn't, I risked being invisible in a way that felt even worse than the silence I had grown accustomed to. I became a master of quiet observation, cataloging who got the smiles, the hugs, the accolades, and who always remained on the outskirts. And every time I left a gathering, I carried that familiar lump in my throat, that hollow sense of being unwanted, alongside me into the cold night. This quiet suffering didn't just live in holidays. It seeped into birthdays, family vacations, even casual weekends when everyone was supposed to come together. I learned to anticipate being excluded before it even happened. I learned to lower my expectations so that disappointment wouldn't hit as hard. Yet, the more I tried to accept it, the more it gnawed at me. I began to notice how easily my sister's twins were celebrated for the smallest achievements, how my parents fawned over them for accomplishments I had spent years striving toward, and how the dog, yes, even the dog, seemed to get more affection and attention than I ever did. I stayed quiet because it felt safer. Arguing, protesting, or expressing my hurt only led to awkward silences or gentle reminders that I was overreacting, that perhaps I was too sensitive. And so, I perfected the skill of masking my pain. I learned to bring thoughtful gifts, to volunteer for chores, to offer help in the kitchen, and to make jokes that would make others laugh while swallowing the bitterness of my exclusion. My happiness became conditional. Small doses I gave to myself in private, moments of fleeting joy that I had to conceal in order to survive. Yet even in the silence, there was a growing determination inside me. The pain of being overlooked and dismissed planted a seed of resilience I hadn't anticipated. I learned to observe, to understand the dynamics of my family, and to see where I had been undervalued for years. That quiet suffering, which once felt like a punishment, gradually became a teacher. It taught me patience, endurance, and most importantly, the value of carving out my own space where I could finally exist without apology or negotiation. I realized that staying quiet wasn't weakness, it was survival. But it also became clear that silence had its limits. There was a point where quiet acceptance could no longer satisfy the longing I carried inside me, the longing to be seen, to matter, and to celebrate without constraints. That point would come years later, but the foundation was built during those long seasons of silent suffering. I carried it with me into adulthood, a heavy, bittersweet inheritance that shaped my sense of self and my quiet determination to one day create a space that would be completely my own. The years of being sidelined, of quietly watching my sister's twins and their dog receive all the attention, had consequences that I felt deep in my chest, even if I didn't fully understand them at the time. It wasn't just sadness, it was a persistent, gnawing ache that followed me into my teenage years, into adulthood, and into every corner of my life where I expected warmth and acceptance. I began to internalize the message my family had repeated again and again, through words and actions, that there wasn't room for my children, for me, for the life I wanted to share with the people I loved. That message became a shadow, creeping into my thoughts, shaping how I saw myself and how I believed others saw me. I remember sitting alone in my room as a teenager, staring out the window at the winter snow falling softly on the streets below. I could hear the laughter of my sister's twins echoing faintly through the house, their dog barking excitedly in the background. I wanted to run into the chaos, to be part of it, but I knew it wasn't my place. The rejection, though unspoken in so many moments, had been clear enough to understand. I felt small, invisible, and unworthy of the space that others seemed to take for granted. That feeling, subtle at first, hardened over the years into a quiet but unrelenting self-doubt that haunted me in unexpected moments. Even as I built a life outside of my family, the impact lingered. Social events, office parties, even casual gatherings with friends sometimes brought back the same sharp, almost physical ache I had first felt as a child. I would smile politely, laugh when prompted, and participate, all the while carrying the echo of those words, "There's no room for your kids." They were a silent mantra, a reminder that I had been deemed unworthy of inclusion. It affected my confidence, my sense of belonging, and my ability to advocate for myself in moments when I deserved recognition. I realized that exclusion could be subtle yet devastating, leaving invisible scars that shaped decisions, relationships, and self-perception. At times, the emotional impact manifested as frustration and anger that I didn't always understand. Why were my sister's twins celebrated for everything while I had to stay in the background? Why was my voice never the one heard around the dinner table? Those questions echoed through my mind, unanswered, fueling a quiet resentment that I carried like a hidden weight. I feared expressing it, knowing that confrontation might lead to guilt, shame, or further dismissal, so I buried it deep within myself. That emotional labor, of hiding the hurt while witnessing favoritism, became exhausting, and yet it was my only strategy to survive in a family that didn't seem to have room for me. But the emotional impact wasn't all destructive. In the quiet moments of pain and longing, I also discovered resilience I didn't know I possessed. I learned to care for my own emotional well-being in subtle ways, finding small pockets of joy in books, in music, in the company of friends who appreciated me. I began to understand that my worth wasn't tied to the approval of a family that could never make space for me. The exclusion, though deeply painful, forced me to reflect, to grow, and to start imagining a life where I could create my own space, one where I and those I loved could exist freely, without the shadow of dismissal hovering over us. By the time I reached my 30s, the emotional impact had shaped me into someone quiet, observant, and patient, but also determined. The hurt I had carried for decades became fuel, a quiet, persistent motivation to reclaim my story. I understood then that the pain of exclusion had a purpose. It showed me what it felt like to be unseen and undervalued, and in that knowledge, I found the seeds of empowerment. I knew that if I could create a life where my family's limitations no longer mattered, I could finally transform that long-standing ache into something meaningful, a life built on recognition, inclusion, and love that I had always deserved. Turning 35 was supposed to be just another birthday, a quiet acknowledgement of time passing, but for me, it became a revelation. For years, I had carried the weight of exclusion, the constant reminder that my family's celebrations had no space for me or my children. I had endured silent suffering, internalized hurt, and a lingering ache that had followed me through holidays, birthdays, and countless gatherings. But that year, something inside me shifted. I realized that if I didn't take control of my life, if I continued to wait for approval that would never come, I would remain invisible forever. I spent that birthday sitting alone in my small apartment, the faint hum of the city outside my window, and thinking about all the years I had spent shrinking myself, hiding my dreams, and quieting my own voice. I thought about the countless dinners where my sister's twins had run riot through the living room, my parents laughing and fawning over them, while I sat at the edge of it all, swallowed by silence. I remembered the hollow ache, the tiny pangs of longing, and the resignation that had become almost second nature. And for the first time in decades, I felt a surge of defiance alongside the hurt, a quiet, burning realization that I didn't need their approval to exist or thrive. That evening, as I sat with a glass of wine and the soft glow of city lights reflecting through my window, I began to imagine a different life. I pictured a space where my children could run freely without restraint, where I could host gatherings that celebrated us rather than excluded us, where joy wasn't conditional on someone else's convenience. I imagined laughter that wasn't accompanied by judgment, love that wasn't measured by favoritism, and a home that belonged entirely to me. For the first time, I felt the clarity to see that I could create this life, not just dream about it, but actually make it real. I realized that the turning point wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about showing my family that they had made a mistake or forcing recognition. No, this moment was about me, about reclaiming the years that had been lost to quiet suffering and turning them into a foundation for a life I deserved. I understood that the past could not be changed, but the future was mine to shape, and it would be shaped with intention, love, and freedom. The realization sparked a plan. I began to think strategically, imagining the steps I would take to build a life that reflected my worth and the worth of my children. I researched neighborhoods, apartments, and possibilities, analyzing every option with meticulous care. I began saving every bonus, every extra dollar, every bit of income one could spare. I refused to let impatience or doubt derail me. Every day, I reminded myself that the space I had been denied for so long could now be created, and that I had the power, finally, to manifest it. But alongside the excitement, I felt vulnerability. It wasn't easy to shake decades of internalized belief that I wasn't enough, that my happiness had to fit into the margins of someone else's life. Yet even the fear couldn't dampen the clarity that had settled in me. This was my turning point. The moment when quiet resignation transformed into determined action, when longing became possibility, when the ache of years past became fuel for a future built entirely on my own terms. By the end of that night, I made a vow to myself. I promised that I would never again shrink to make others comfortable. I promised that I would carve out the space I and my children deserved. And most importantly, I promised that I would honor the little girl inside me, the one who had spent decades watching others take up space, by finally claiming a place where we could all belong, fully, unapologetically, and without limitation. That birthday was no longer just a number, it was the birth of a new chapter, one that would lead me to freedom, empowerment, and the life I had always imagined but never dared to claim, until now. Once the realization hit me, that I could no longer wait for my family to create space for me, I knew that action was the only path forward. Thinking about a different life was one thing, imagining it in fleeting moments while lying awake at night, but making it real required focus, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to myself. I had spent decades on the sidelines, quiet and invisible, but now, the years of silent endurance became my fuel. I began to envision a tangible goal, a home of my own, a space where my children and I could exist without apology, a place that would reflect our worth, our laughter, and our freedom. I started with the practical steps, those small but deliberate actions that would ultimately lead to transformation. Every bonus at work, every extra commission, every paycheck beyond the essentials went into a savings account that I treated as sacred. I resisted the temptation to spend on things that would momentarily comfort me, knowing that the true reward would be something far greater than a fleeting indulgence. I spent hours researching real estate listings, walking through apartments, imagining layouts, and considering which spaces would give my children room to play and me the peace I had long yearned for. I studied floor plans late into the night, annotating corners that could hold a reading nook, walls that could display family photos, terraces where the sun would warm our mornings. I also had to confront the doubts that crept in quietly, as they always do when you attempt to claim what is yours. The voice inside me asked if I could really do it, if I was deserving after so many years of being overlooked. I confronted those doubts by reminding myself of the small victories I had accumulated over time, the years of saving, the careful planning, the ability to endure hardship without losing hope. Each step I took reinforced the truth that I was capable, that I was worthy, and that the life I imagined was attainable. Action became my lifeline. I made appointments with brokers, visited neighborhoods I had only dreamed about, and imagined my children running freely through the spaces I would one day call home. Every visit, every calculation, every conversation brought me closer to making my dream concrete. I learned to negotiate with confidence, to stand firm on the details that mattered, and to trust my instincts about what would serve our future best. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. For the first time, I realized the magnitude of what I was attempting. I wasn't just buying property, I was reclaiming years of exclusion, redefining what home meant, and proving to myself that I had the power to create the life I deserved. Finally, after months of meticulous planning and saving, the day arrived. I signed the papers for a penthouse in New York, a space that was more than just walls and windows, it was freedom manifested. Standing there with the keys in my hand, I felt a rush of emotion unlike anything I had ever experienced. Relief, pride, anticipation, and joy mingled inside me. I thought of the years of holidays where I had felt invisible, of the dinners where my children had been told there was no room for them. Those memories stung, but now they served as a stark contrast to the reality I had created, a reality where there was finally room for us. Taking action had changed everything. It wasn't a sudden, magical transformation. It was a process, a deliberate and sometimes exhausting pursuit of what I knew I deserved. Each choice, each step, each sacrifice had been a declaration that my happiness and my children's happiness were not negotiable. And as I held the keys to our new home, I understood that the true power of action isn't just in achieving a goal, it's in reclaiming control over your story, in turning years of hurt into determination, and in creating a life where joy, love, and belonging are no longer conditional. The first time I stepped into my penthouse alone, I felt something I had never experienced before, a sense of ownership so profound that it made my chest ache. The walls were bare, the floors gleaming, and the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, letting in the golden afternoon sunlight. For the first time in my life, I wasn't entering someone else's space or waiting for permission to exist within it. This was mine. Every corner, every shadow, every ray of light belonged to me and to my children. The realization washed over me in waves, a mixture of relief, exhilaration, and gratitude. I had finally claimed the space that had been denied to me for decades, a space where we could breathe, laugh, and live freely. I remember the first holiday I celebrated there. I had spent weeks decorating, imagining the joy I wanted to create for my children. Ornaments shimmered on the tree, candles flickered softly on tables, and the scent of baked goods filled the apartment. There was no negotiation, no whispered apologies, no reminders that we didn't belong. My children ran freely, their laughter echoing against walls that were ours alone. The dog darted through the rooms, chasing tinsel, and I watched it all with a sense of wonder I hadn't felt since childhood. The joy in that moment was intoxicating, not because it was extravagant, but because it was fully ours, completely authentic, and undeniably ours to claim. I realized, standing there amid the chaos and celebration, that claiming my space was about more than just four walls and a roof. It was about reclaiming my life, my voice, and my presence in a world where I had been silenced for so long. For the first time, I could host holidays without compromise, create traditions that reflected my family's values, and give my children memories that weren't tinged with exclusion. I had built a home where love and belonging weren't measured by someone else's convenience. They were inherent, abundant, and unapologetic. Even when my phone buzzed with messages from my parents and my sister, half surprised, half incredulous, I didn't falter. Their opinions no longer held the power to dictate how I felt about myself or my life. For the first time, I understood the true meaning of space. It isn't just about physical dimensions, but about emotional and psychological freedom. I had created a sanctuary where we could exist fully, where our voices could be heard, our presence recognized, and our happiness prioritized. The penthouse became a canvas for our lives. Mornings were filled with sunlight streaming onto breakfast tables where my children could eat without fear of being pushed aside. Afternoons were spent laughing, playing, and creating memories that I had once thought unattainable. Evenings were ours to savor, to reflect on the day, to feel the deep satisfaction of a life lived on our own terms. Each moment reinforced the power of claiming space, not just in the literal sense, but in the way it allowed us to step into the fullness of our existence. In claiming this space, I also claimed myself. I embraced the woman who had endured years of quiet suffering, the mother who had watched her children denied love and recognition, and the dreamer who had spent countless nights imagining a life that seemed impossible. Standing in the penthouse, I finally acknowledged that all those years of hurt had led to this moment, a moment of liberation, empowerment, and undeniable self-worth. Claiming my space was the ultimate act of defiance and love. It was proof that exclusion could be transformed into action, pain into purpose, and longing into reality. And as I looked around at the life I had built, I understood something profound. No one could ever take this from us, no one could dictate our joy, and no one could erase the fact that we had finally found our place in the world, a place that was entirely, unapologetically ours. Standing in my penthouse, watching the city lights shimmer like 1,000 tiny promises, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never known before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't defined by other people's limitations, judgments, or indifference. I wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's expectations, nor was I quietly enduring exclusion or disappointment. I had created a life that reflected my worth, a space that celebrated my presence and my children's presence without compromise. That empowerment wasn't sudden or easy. It had been built over years of quiet suffering, reflection, planning, and ultimately action, but now it was real, tangible, and undeniable. I realized that empowerment begins with self-love. For so long, I had sought validation from people who were unwilling to give it. I had believed, in small ways and large, that their recognition mattered more than my own happiness. But the penthouse, the freedom to celebrate my children without restriction, and the joy we now experience together made me see that love and recognition must start within. I had to love myself enough to demand space, to create opportunities, and to refuse to settle for less than we deserved. That self-love became my armor, my guide, and the foundation for the life I had fought so hard to build. There were moments in the early days when the reality of empowerment felt almost surreal. I would watch my children play, hear their laughter echoing through the rooms that were entirely ours, and feel tears prick my eyes. It wasn't just happiness, it was relief, gratitude, and triumph all rolled into one. I thought back to the holidays of my childhood, the countless gatherings where I was invisible, where my children were told there was no room for them, and I felt a powerful contrast. Those memories no longer held me hostage. Instead, they reminded me how far I had come and how much strength I had discovered within myself. Empowerment, I realized, wasn't just about what I had gained, it was about what I had learned to release. I released the need for approval from people who had never seen me, the weight of disappointment carried silently for decades, and the fear of confrontation or rejection. Each release created space for confidence, joy, and clarity. I began to see that claiming my space and my happiness was not selfish, it was necessary. And the more I embraced this truth, the more fully I stepped into life, daring to dream bigger, act bolder, and love more deeply. Self-love also meant teaching my children the value of their own worth. I wanted them to grow up knowing that they are seen, that their voices matter, and that they deserve space, joy, and celebration. Watching them run through our penthouse, laughing, creating memories, and exploring freely, I felt a profound satisfaction. I realized that empowerment is contagious. It spreads, it nurtures, and it creates a cycle of confidence and courage that can transform generations. By loving myself, I was teaching my children to love themselves. As the night settled over the city and the penthouse glowed softly in the warm light, I understood the true meaning of empowerment. It isn't just a state of mind. It's a choice, a practice, and a commitment to honor yourself and your life. It's about turning past hurt into fuel for action, transforming exclusion into freedom, and claiming joy without apology. It's about being unapologetically seen, fully present, and unafraid to occupy the space that is rightfully yours. In that moment, I felt complete, not because life was perfect, but because I had learned to trust myself, to honor my worth, and to celebrate the life I had fought so hard to create. Empowerment and self-love weren't destinations. They were the tools, the mindset, and the freedom that allowed me to finally live fully. And as I stood there, surrounded by the life I had built, I knew that no one could ever take this from me. I had claimed my story, my space, and my joy. I had become the author of my own life, and that, more than anything, was the most powerful feeling in the world. True happiness comes from creating your own space, valuing yourself, and embracing the life you deserve, without waiting for anyone else's approval.